I was halfway through changing the oil on my '96 Jeep Wrangler when I noticed the flatbed tow truck creeping down my street like a vulture looking for roadkill. It stopped right in front of my driveway. My Jeep mud-splattered, dented, and proudly mine sat parked on the concrete I paid for with my own 2 hands. The driver stepped out and glanced at a clipboard. "You Francis Palmer?" "Yeah," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Why?" "Got an order to tow the Jeep. Says it's in violation of HOA regulations. Something about non-operational vehicle left exposed." I stared at him. "It's not only operational, it's literally mid-maintenance. You see the oil pan." Before he could answer, I heard the clack of heels on pavement. Enter Margaret Tilling, president of our HOA, the queen of beige fences and passive-aggressive newsletters. She was in her usual battle outfit, oversized sunglasses, clipboard, and that expression like she just smelled sour milk. "Francis," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We've warned you, that eyesore has been sitting there for days." "It's my driveway," I said, "and I drive it daily. I'm just doing maintenance." "It's in violation," she snapped. Section 14B of the Community Appearance Standards. Vehicles must be garaged unless in active use, and that thing's clearly not running. "That's not a real rule," I shot back, stepping between her and the tow truck. "I read the bylaws cover to cover when I bought this place." Margaret's lips tightened. "Maybe your grandfather didn't explain how we run things here." Wrong move. Because that's when my grandfather, Earl Palmer, limped out from the garage. 80 years old, Vietnam vet, and sharper than anyone I know. He lit a cigarette, something he only did when he was about to tear someone apart. "You quoting fake rules again, Margaret?" She turned red. "Mr. Palmer, I assure you, you assure me nothing," Grandpa snapped. "I built this house in '78 before your HOA even existed. My grandson owns it now, but that Jeep's parked on private property. You got no authority here." "Section 14B is clear." "Then show it to me," Grandpa said, pulling a copy of the HOA bylaws from under his arm. He flipped through page after page. Funny, because 14B says nothing about driveways. It says vehicles visibly inoperable for more than 30 days. This Jeep's obviously being worked on. That's legal. The tow truck driver looked between us. "So, I'm not towing it." Before Margaret could answer, Grandpa stepped forward, jabbing a finger at the clipboard. "If you touch that Jeep, that's trespassing. And if you, Margaret, knowingly filed a false request to tow, that's fraud. You want to see the sheriff out here?" She blinked. Then turned on her heel and stomped away, muttering something about needing to review the documents. Grandpa looked at me and grinned. "Next time, put a note on the windshield that says in use. That'll shut her up for at least a week." I laughed. "Thanks, Grandpa." But something in Margaret's eyes told me this wasn't over. By the following Thursday, a notice appeared taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve, sealed with the HOA's gold embossed emblem like it was some royal decree. I didn't touch it right away. Grandpa was in the backyard rebuilding a fishing rod he'd found at a garage sale, and I figured it was better to go through it together. When I finally peeled it off and read it, a low whistle escaped me. "Violation escalation," I read aloud. "Proceeding to arbitration for non-compliance." "That's new." Grandpa looked up from his workbench, eyes narrowing. "They're bluffing again. Arbitration's only valid if both parties agree. Let's see what else they cooked up." Inside, we spread the letter across the kitchen table. It wasn't just a warning. It included a list of supposed infractions: unapproved vehicle maintenance, visual obstruction, failure to adhere to community aesthetics, and this one made Grandpa laugh: environmental hazard due to fluid discharge. "They're making stuff up faster than they can spell it," he said, grabbing his reading glasses. "This is all about control. They're hoping if they bury you in violations, you'll just roll over." "They're underestimating how stubborn I am," I said. "And you." That night, I dug into the HOA's records. We still had access to the member portal. They launched last year, mostly filled with bland newsletters and endless PDFs about shrub height regulations. But buried in their meeting minutes was something interesting. Margaret had pushed a new resolution 2 months ago to expand HOA authority to include driveways in their enforcement scope. The vote had failed. I printed it, highlighted the rejection, and stapled it to my fridge. The next morning, a new character entered the picture, a man in a pressed shirt and thin tie knocking confidently at my door. "Mr. Palmer," he asked, "name's Ronald Dempsey, legal counsel for the HOA. "You're about 2 steps from trespassing," Grandpa said from behind me, arms crossed. Dempsey raised his hands. "Not here to argue, just delivering notice of a scheduled hearing. Optional attendance, but you have the right to present your defense." "Defense against what?" I asked. He smiled in that practiced way attorneys do when they want to seem reasonable but are hoping you'll dig your own grave. "The board believes your actions show a pattern of disregard for community standards. This is your chance to clarify your position." Grandpa took the papers from him, skimmed them, then looked up. "We'll be there, but you better bring your real bylaws this time." 2 days later, we walked into the HOA's meeting room normally used for bingo nights and craft fairs. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a long, folding table. Margaret sat at the center, flanked by 2 board members and Dempsey. A few curious residents sat in the back, halfway through their coffee and cookies. Margaret gestured to a seat. "Mr. Palmer." "Thank you for attending." "I brought documentation," I said, placing the folder on the table, "including the rejected motion from March that would have allowed you to regulate driveways." One of the board members, a guy named Craig with an unfortunate toupee, leaned forward. "That's not relevant. The board has broad discretion under the General Nuisance Clause." Grandpa pointed a thick finger at him. "You mean the same clause that was overturned in the Mendez vs. Clearview case last year? That clause doesn't hold water unless you prove measurable harm." Dempsey cleared his throat. "The board is concerned with the long-term impact of visible maintenance. It creates an atmosphere of neglect." I raised an eyebrow. "So now maintenance is neglect?" Margaret clicked her pen. "We're not here for debate. We're here to decide whether your continued disregard warrants a fine and a formal lien." The room went quiet. "A lien? That was serious." Grandpa didn't flinch. "You try to file a lien on this property using fabricated violations and we'll countersue for malicious prosecution. That includes civil penalties and legal costs." Dempsey leaned back. "Let's keep this civil." "We are," Grandpa replied, "but I'm not letting you extort my grandson under the guise of community improvement." Margaret's eyes darted to the residents in the back. They were now fully paying attention. I opened the folder again. "I also brought photos. This one's from the day you tried to have my Jeep towed, time-stamped. Clearly shows I was performing maintenance. This one shows the tow truck parked illegally across the sidewalk, and this one. That's your own board member's son working on his car in their driveway last week. No citation issued." Craig shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's face tightened. "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene after reviewing the evidence." "No need," Grandpa said. "We're filing a complaint with the city attorney tomorrow. We've documented the selective enforcement, false claims, and fraudulent towing request." Dempsey stood, suddenly serious. "Let's not escalate this." "You already did," I said. "Now we're pushing back." We left the meeting with every eye in the room following us. Outside, Grandpa lit another cigarette. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You see how she panicked when the neighbors started listening?" I nodded. "She's losing the room." Back home, we started drafting the complaint. Grandpa had contacts in the county clerk's office, old friends from his days working city infrastructure. By that afternoon, we had filed a formal grievance citing abuse of authority, false representation of bylaws, and attempted property interference. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the city. They were opening an investigation. Not just into the towing attempt, but into the HOA's broader pattern of enforcement. Apparently, ours wasn't the only complaint. That night, our doorbell rang. It was Nate from 3 houses down. Electrician, father of 4, and usually too tired to get involved with anything. "I heard what happened," he said. "Margaret fined me last month for having my work van in the driveway overnight, said it was commercial visibility infringement. I didn't fight it because I thought I was alone." "You're not," I said. He nodded. "Let me know what you need." "I'll testify." By week's end, we had statements from 6 residents. All of them had been hit with obscure or made-up violations. One woman had been fined for unsanctioned garden lighting. Another had been told her porch wind chimes were a noise disturbance. Each one had paid, afraid to fight back. But now, they were ready. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the tide had turned. What started as a petty power move over a Jeep had become something else, a reckoning. And it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she'd leaned on for too long. The following Tuesday, the city investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Marlene Cho, arrived in a gray hybrid sedan and walked up to my porch with a leather binder tucked under her arm. She didn't waste time on small talk. "I'm from the Municipal Oversight Committee," she said. "Mind if we talk inside?" I led her to the dining table, clearing off the pile of neighborhood testimonies we'd gathered. She slid her binder open, revealing a stack of annotated documents, a handheld recorder, and a legal pad already half filled with notes. "When we received your complaint," she said, "we flagged this HOA for pattern review. It turns out yours isn't the only neighborhood where similar tactics were reported. What we need now is corroboration, names, dates, and any hard evidence you've got." I passed her our folder. Grandpa had organized it meticulously. Each page was numbered and tabbed. Photos, community statements, logs of phone calls, and even a printout showing the HOA's own online calendar with no record of the so-called violations hearing they claimed I had skipped last month. Marlene's eyes flicked through the pages. "This is thorough," she muttered. "Very thorough." Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Miss Turner, a retired school principal from 2 streets over. She didn't say a word, just handed me an envelope and walked away. Inside were copies of 3 letters. One threatening her with a lien over a supposed unpainted fence, which was clearly fine. One demanding architectural review for a bird bath, and one notifying her of a special assessment fee for a community event she never attended. I handed the envelope to Marlene. She nodded slowly. "This confirms what we suspected. There's a secondary document stream, letters issued without board approval or vote." "They're not just making up rules," I said. "They're inventing a shadow system." That afternoon, Marlene visited 3 other homeowners who had agreed to speak. Meanwhile, Grandpa made a quiet call to someone he hadn't spoken to in a while, his old friend Judge Alan Forrester, who was now semi-retired and teaching part-time at the local law college. They met for lunch at a diner near the courthouse. When Grandpa came back, he dropped a manila folder on the kitchen counter. "Alan says if the HOA filed lien threats without legitimate cause, that's mail fraud. If they cashed any of the bogus fines, they're looking at wire fraud too." I stared at him. "That's federal," he nodded. And the judge already passed the info to a prosecutor he trusts. 2 days later, agents from the County Fraud Division appeared at the HOA's office, an annex building behind the clubhouse that always looked more like a storage shed than a place of governance. They walked in with a warrant and walked out with 2 desktop towers, boxes of paper files, and the HOA's treasurer, a guy named Wendell, who looked like he'd just swallowed a battery. By the next morning, news had spread. Not just within our neighborhood, but across the HOA's entire management firm, which handled 5 other communities across the county. Residents were furious. Some showed up at the clubhouse demanding refunds for fines they'd paid under threat of liens. Others started organizing impromptu meetings on driveways and front lawns, comparing letters, checking dates, and matching up the exact same wording used in fines that supposedly came from different board members. I was in the middle of helping Nate install a motion sensor after someone unplugged his security camera when Margaret's sedan pulled up in front of my house. She stepped out with her usual rigidity, but something was different now. She wasn't carrying her clipboard. Her hair was unkempt. Her eyes darted between houses like the world had suddenly turned against her. She walked right up to me and stopped a few feet short. "I didn't authorize any of that," she said, her voice low. "Didn't authorize what?" I asked, keeping my hands on the ladder. "Those fines. The towing." Wendell handled enforcement. I trusted him. Grandpa stepped out from the garage, wiping grease off his forearms. "You signed the notices, your name's on the letters." "I was told they were standard," she said. "Form letters?" "Then why did the board vote to reject the driveway clause and you tried to enforce it anyway?" I asked. She glanced toward the street. A few neighbors had stepped out with their dogs or coffee cups, not pretending to mind their business. "I didn't think anyone would care," she said. "You were wrong," Grandpa replied. That night, the board held an emergency meeting, this time open to all residents. They moved it to the community park because the clubhouse was still being combed through by investigators. Almost 50 people showed up, standing or sitting on folding chairs under the pavilion lights, some with coolers, others with notepads. The atmosphere wasn't angry, it was surgical. Focused. Craig, the toupee-wearing board member who'd previously defended the bogus hearings, stood up and announced he was stepping down. So did the secretary. That left Margaret and one remaining member who was too new to have signed anything yet. Marlene was there, quietly observing from the edge. After Craig left, she stepped forward and addressed the crowd. Based on documents recovered and testimony gathered, the county will be reviewing all enforcement actions from the past 18 months. If you received a fine, lien notice, or fee during that window, you are eligible for review and potential reimbursement. A cheer went up, but it was subdued, more relief than celebration. Margaret didn't return home that night. Her car was gone by morning, and a "for sale by owner" sign was staked in her front yard before the sun was fully up. No one saw her pack. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the county prosecutor's office. Wendell had been indicted on 6 counts: falsifying documents, misappropriation of funds, mail fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts of abuse of fiduciary duty. Margaret wasn't facing charges yet, but the investigation was ongoing. The HOA was placed under court supervision, and a temporary administrator was appointed. A retired city planner named Doris Kim, who immediately froze all fines and suspended enforcement until a full audit was complete. We were finally able to breathe. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the rooftops, a few of us gathered on my driveway. Grandpa, Nate, Miss Turner, and a couple from the next block who just returned from visiting their daughter in college. "You know," Nate said, cracking open a soda, "for a while I thought I was just being paranoid. Like maybe I'd imagined how bad it was getting." Grandpa nodded. "That's how people like this operate. They isolate you. Make you feel like you're the only one." "But the second we started talking to each other," Miss Turner added, "everything changed." I looked at the Jeep, still parked right where it always had been, still muddy, still mine. "You think they'll try anything again?" I asked. Grandpa leaned back in his chair and looked up at the dusk sky. "If they're smart, no, but if they do, we've already built the blueprint for how to handle it." He wasn't talking about papers or procedures, he meant the people, the neighbors, all of us. And for the first time in a long time, we felt like a community, not because someone forced us into compliance, but because we stood up when it mattered, and we weren't sitting down again. The last of the summer humidity had finally broken when the subpoenas started arriving. They came by certified mail, each one bearing the county seal and the stiff formality of something that couldn't be ignored. Grandpa received his first, then Miss Turner, then Nate. Each envelope came with an official request to testify before the grand jury in the matter of the people vs. Wendell C., Larkin, and associated parties. No one said it aloud, but we all knew. The investigation had turned criminal federal, not just county, and it went deeper than we'd thought. 2 weeks earlier, the forensic audit team had uncovered a series of wire transfers from the HOA's operating account to a shell company registered in Florida. That company, it turned out, was linked to a property management firm that had been suspended 3 years ago for embezzlement in another state. The treasurer, Wendell, had quietly funneled over $80,000 from the HOA's reserve fund into that account under the guise of vendor maintenance disbursements. But the vendors didn't exist. During a closed-door deposition, Wendell tried to pin the disbursements on an automated accounting error, unaware that the city had already obtained bank surveillance footage of him making cash withdrawals from the shell company's linked ATM card 13 times across 2 counties. Once the first charge stuck, the others followed like dominoes. Margaret became the next focus. Her signature appeared on nearly every requisition form Wendell had submitted. Worse, the city unearthed emails from her official HOA account emails where she'd ordered the suppression of board meeting notes, directed false threats of lien to be mailed, and even offered to approve special action fines if Wendell could keep things quiet about a budget shortfall. The phrase, "keep things quiet," ended up on the front page of the local paper. By the time our grand jury testimonies began, the whole neighborhood had turned, not just against the HOA board, but against the idea that anyone could operate in shadows again. Residents started forming independent neighborhood watch groups not for crime, but for transparency. One of the couples who lived near the playground put up a dry erase board on their fence labeled HOA Oversight, where neighbors added questions or concerns and got real answers within a day. The whole feel of the community changed, less fearful, more neighborly. No more quiet resentment behind trimmed hedges. People actually waved again. The grand jury proceedings took place in the downtown courthouse, a building older than most of the streets in our subdivision. On the morning of my testimony, I wore jeans and a flannel shirt. Grandpa insisted on a collared shirt, but I refused. "I'm telling the truth," I told him. Not applying for a job, he didn't argue. Inside, the courtroom was colder than expected, and the panel of jurors sat behind a long oak railing, watching with quiet intensity. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Lena Hart, asked me to recount the events of the day the Jeep was targeted. I gave her the exact sequence: tow truck arrival, Margaret's confrontation, Grandpa producing the bylaws, and the fabricated violation. Then she asked the part that mattered more. "Did you at any point, Mr. Palmer, receive a legitimate written notice of violation, properly voted on by the board before or after that incident?" "No," I said. Not a single one of them followed the process outlined in the HOA's governing documents. They bypassed the board, ignored due process, and used threats to scare people into paying. She nodded, then paused. "Did you feel targeted personally?" "No," I answered. "I think Margaret and Wendell would have gone after anyone who didn't roll over." I was just the first one who pushed back. The jury asked no questions. I was thanked and dismissed. Grandpa went in next. He didn't bring notes, didn't need them. When he came out 20 minutes later, he stopped next to me in the hallway. "You know what one of them asked me?" he said. Wanted to know what I thought motivated Margaret to sign off on all this. "What you say?" He scratched his cheek. "Told them it's like a rifle with a faulty sight. Power doesn't make it accurate, just more dangerous." 3 days later, the indictments dropped. Wendell was charged with 6 felony counts, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. Margaret was hit with 3: conspiracy to commit fraud, misuse of fiduciary authority, and obstruction of a legal investigation. She tried to delete her HOA email account the night the subpoenas were issued. IT recovered everything. The court froze both of their assets. Wendell was arrested in a strip mall parking lot trying to withdraw cash from a prepaid card. Margaret turned herself in a day later, escorted by her brother, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The city announced the appointment of a legal trustee to oversee our HOA until new elections could be held under monitored supervision. This time, the ballots would be counted by a third-party auditor. No more secret meetings. No more hand-picked committees. The new trustee, a former compliance officer named Roland Kemp, set up a folding table in the park every Saturday morning with a single sign. "Talk to me." Anyone could walk up. No appointments, no gatekeeping. At the second Saturday meeting, I brought a copy of the old bylaws, now annotated with sticky notes and highlighter marks from our ordeal. I handed it to Roland. "You should have this," I said. "It's the version nobody doctored." He flipped through it, nodded once, and tucked it into his bag. "You know," he said, "most neighborhoods don't fight back, they just leave." "We thought about it," I admitted. "But we figured if we walked away, someone else would get hit next. Most people wouldn't stay and fix the fire, they'd just move out of the kitchen." "Well," I said, "my grandpa's not most people." A week before the trial, I came home to find a small crowd gathered in front of the community bulletin board. The one Margaret used to flood with her printed reminders and urgent notices. Someone had taken them all down and replaced them with a single laminated sign that read, "Know your rights." Below it was a QR code linked to a public archive of the HOA's governing documents, the auditor reports, and a list of resources for homeowners dealing with overreach. It was anonymous, but I had a pretty good idea who put it up. At Wendell's sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. "This was not a mistake," he said. "This was a methodical siphoning of community trust. You treated your neighbors like marks. You used legal language as camouflage for theft. And you recruited others to shield you." Wendell was sentenced to 9 years. Margaret received 5, with 2 on probation. The judge noted that while she hadn't personally profited, she'd enabled the fraud and harmed dozens through coercion and deceit. Back home, the Jeep still sat in the driveway. I never moved it to the garage, not because of defiance anymore, but because I didn't have to. The next HOA election was scheduled under Roland's supervision. Nate ran for a board seat and won by a landslide. Miss Turner joined the Architectural Review Committee, and Grandpa, he politely declined a nomination to chair the Compliance Board. "Let someone else take a turn," he said. "I've earned a break." But he still came to every meeting. Sat in the back with coffee in a thermos, and that same quiet look, the one that said he was watching. Not because he didn't trust the new folks, but because trust is something you guard, not give away. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the rooftops, Grandpa looked over at me. "You know," he said, "when I built this house, I never thought I'd see neighbors afraid of their own community. You think we fixed it?" He took a long sip from his thermos. "We reminded them who it belongs to, and that was enough."